Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Rohit Kumar. He's principal and national tax services co-leader at the consulting firm PwC. Before joining PwC, he held senior policy positions for Senate Republican leaders Trent Lott, Bill Frist, and Mitch McConnell, including Deputy Chief of Staff for Leader McConnell. He has his law degree from the University of Virginia. We'll be talking about the near-term future of tax policy, including what's likely to happen in a lame duck session of Congress. And perhaps we'll do some rank speculation and talk about next year as well. Before we begin, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be hosted online at TPC's website. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Rohit Kumar, welcome back to The Prescription.
Thanks for having me back.
Good to see you. So let's start by talking about what Congress may do about taxes in a post-election session. Obviously, we have an election that has to come first. There are lots of possible outcomes to that. So we're going to have to do a certain amount of speculating. But first of all, how do you think the outcomes of the election are going to affect the way the parties think about a lame duck session?
So to me, I mean, it's sort of binary. You're either going to have full Democratic control of the House, Senate, and White House yet again for another 2 years, or you're going to have some form of divided government, whether that's House and Senate or just House, remains to be seen. But in a world where most commentators, most election handicappers would have you believe that the House is likely to change control. And that's sort of your majority outcome scenario in terms of post-election planning. Look, in that world, it is, of course, possible that a lame duck tax bill comes together. But I think it is perhaps challenging, especially to the extent that the Democrats who will still be in charge, right? You don't get the new Congress until January. To the extent that the price of entry, kind of the cover charge of doing something at year end, is a sort of significant child tax credit piece, I think that's going to be a significant political hurdle and policy hurdle, not just political hurdle, but policy hurdle for Republicans to overcome, having in this hypothetical, having just taken over the House or just having won an election that will give them control of the House, a few short months down the road. And so that, to me, as the House changing control, seems like the most likely outcome. And of course, there's no guarantees. The election is still a bit off. But if that is the outcome that we find ourselves in, then it's hard to imagine that happening. And then immediately thereafter, what you might call a significant expansion, a la March 2021 COVID relief bill, something on that order of magnitude, I just think won't be in the cards. And then the question becomes, that's something the House and Senate Democrats are talking about today. Does that change in a lame duck environment where the House has changed control, or does that remain the order of the day up until January of 2023?
So we know that there are a couple of must-do pieces of legislation. There'll be a continuing resolution to get us through mid-December, but there's going to have to be some other bill to keep the government running by the end of the year. There'll probably have to be a defense authorization bill. Is there anything else that Congress has to do?
I don't, well, has to do will be then in the eye of the beholder. So government funding is clearly a sort of feels like a has to do type exercise. So government funding feels like have to do. Defense authorization is typically done. Like there's a streak that goes back 50, 60 years of doing a defense authorization bill, right? And then after that, some would say child tax credits has to do. Others, not everyone would agree with that, obviously. I think there's overwhelmingly bipartisan support for continuing to allow companies to fully expense their 174 R&D expenses. But what is that something that we all just do together, or does that come at some political cost? I think that becomes a more complicated question. And then there are other TCJA provisions, or TCJA, the loss of depreciation from the 163J, the starting to be expensing from 100% to 80%. Trade adjustment assistance expired earlier this year. And then there is the retirement year 2.0, all of which I think are very much in the would like to do, lots of support for doing, differing coalitions of votes in the House and Senate amongst Democrats and Republicans. But I think in the must do, it's government funding. And, there are a couple other things that are right with government funding, like FDA user fees that are, likely to be kind of dealt with as a part of that transaction. I have a hard time thinking of anything else that is must do. There's lots of like to do's.
So as you suggested, on those like-to-do lists, the business community has a number of provisions that have expired or will expire this year. The two biggest, allowing companies to expense experimentation costs in the year they're incurred, and extending 100% bonus depreciation. Business also is interested in restoring the pre-22 limits on interest deductions. Progressives, on the other hand, are very, very interested in restoring the 2021 child tax credit. So let's sort of break these up into pieces. Let's talk about the business provisions first. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimates the first year cost of these provisions alone would be $100 billion. And if they're made permanent, the 10-year cost would be $650 billion. Is there any chance that these things will be paid for, even if Congress does them?
I would be very surprised. Congress does not have a recent history of paying for extending expiring tax relief, whether that's on the individual side or the business side or both. Typically, extending current policy, using a current policy baseline, is not something that is paid for or offset in any meaningful way. Only sort of new provisions, like an infrastructure bill, for example, are paid for, and even then, not entirely always. So I would be very surprised. And moreover, I don't think that there is a political market of 60 votes in the Senate for paying for extending expiring tax relief. So my suspicion is probably not.
So it's interesting because the central Republican argument going into the November election is that Democrats have made inflation worse by passing new deficit and increasing spending bills, especially last year's pandemic relief bill. By not proposing pay-fors for their business tax cuts, the Republicans undercutting their own argument.
So I think Republicans would argue the following: that not all fiscal policy is created equally from an inflationary perspective. To the extent that you are, writing on significantly expanding unemployment and payments, or refundable child tax credit, or things like that, that put money immediately in the hands of individuals who are then very likely to immediately spend those dollars chasing goods that are not made more plentiful because we haven't solved the supply chain problem, for example. That is inflationary in its orientation, whereas tax incentives that actually arguably incent businesses to invest in productivity increasing investments is actually not near-term particularly inflationary, and long-term actually would help with inflation, because if you have a more productive workforce, then your more limited labor supply can produce more goods, services, and try to start to ease some of the pressure. I think, frankly, in the short term, it's probably neither here nor there. $600 billion sounds like a lot of money, and to be clear, for Rohit Kumar, that would be a lot of money. But over 10 years for the federal government, $600 billion is like a rounding error, against the tens of trillions of dollars of federal spending that will happen over that period of time in an economy that's even much larger.
We've both been in Washington too long. $600 billion is a rounding error. I don't know how that.
Yeah. Again, not for my bank account, but for the federal government.
There you go. So let me give you a couple of counter arguments to this, just to kind of get reaction. So one of them is the argument you just made, that they make the economy, these business tax benefits make the economy more productive. But do they really? Wouldn't a lot of this investment happen with or without these generous tax breaks?
No, I actually don't think that's right. I think some of this, like look at 174, for example, right? If you tell a US headquartered company, 1/3 of your free cash flow will be tied up in tax payments over the next several years, they will have no choice but to make some hard decisions about investments that would have been made but will no longer be made. That's not to say that all R&D stops. That is clearly not plausible. I don't think anyone's making that argument. But if you're rank ordering most likely, the least likely events start happening, the ones that are higher risk but may have higher long-term payoff, but they're just riskier investments. Those are the ones that drop off. And you think about like the president's climate agenda, for example, right? A lot of like if we're going to hit any of these kind of goals, it's going to require a lot of R&D into a lot of advanced technology that we don't have today, whether that's, energy storage technology or transmission technology, or, whatever is the next breakthrough, clean fuels for aviation. I mean, all of that stuff is going to require a fair bit of R&D. And so again, it's not to say that none of it will happen, but less of it will happen. Same with, the interest limitation rule. Interest limitation gets tighter. We are in a rising interest rate environment. That provision is actually going to start to have a little bit more bite than maybe, it would have if we were at, the historically low interest rates that we had for the last several years, right? Less borrowing capacity means some investments, are just not going to get made. So I don't think you can say, in fact, I'm confident that it is not true that all these investments get made no matter what. It's just a question of which investments don't happen. And that's, playing a little bit of roulette with the economy.
So another argument is that many of the most creative ideas come from startups, and they have no revenue, pay no taxes, and thus can't benefit from these incentives. Are these tax breaks really the best way to encourage U.S. investment?
So it's not, for that segment of the tax-paying population, then, maybe these provisions aren't particularly important. But that's not to say that the companies who care about this are, not providing any kind of, valuable research or doing other productivity increasing enhancements. In fact, arguably, it's the larger companies that can make the productivity increasing developments at scale, right? Just given the size of the taxpayer in question. And so, look, again, it's not that all research will stop or all investment will stop, but at the margins, things start to slow down. And the analogy I like to use, I fly a lot right now because I'm running around the country talking to folks. Let's hypothesize that I was flying to California and someone is on the wing of my plane, right? And we're going to suspend disbelief that they can do this at 35,000 feet. And they're out there and they're talking to me and they say, "Hey, Rohit, I'm going to take one rivet out of the engine that's attached to the wing, right? I'm going to just take one rivet out that's attached to this engine to the wing. How do you feel about that?" Well, do I think that rivet is the thing that's keeping the engine attached? No. Do I want them taking it out? Also no, right? So why should we be taking rivets off the engine that attach it to the rest of the economy, and keep us kind of going forward? I'm mangling the analogy here, but I think you get where I'm going. These are things that drive the economy. And to the extent that we make it harder, less likely that the big next investment happens, that's just not good economic policy.
So you mentioned you've been traveling around the country talking to clients, and I'm actually interested. So some of these tax benefits actually expire at the end of last year. We go through this with all these extenders every year. The feeling always seems to be that Congress will eventually get around to this, so companies act as if they're still a law. We're now in a situation where, as you suggested, these may not get extended. So how are companies actually behaving now in this kind of odd sort of neverland that we always find ourselves in?
Companies are, I would say, it wasn't until after the reconciliation bill got passed without these provisions being dealt with that companies, especially on 174, really started, I think, to say, okay, this may not happen. And we have to start thinking about how are we going to manage the hit. From a cash flow perspective, that's the 174 that probably has the biggest cash flow hit in the very near term to taxpayers. And so that I think companies are for the first time taking a hard look at budgets and trying to figure out what is 23, 24, 25, what does that research budget look like if this tax provision doesn't get extended or doesn't get further delayed by some number of years till 2025. It's been a kind of a common refrain because you line it up with all the expiring individual and passive provisions from the 2017 Act. I think on interest limitation, 163J, frankly, I think most of the taxpayers that care about 163J were swamped with the proposed 163N interest limitation rule that was in the House passed. Build Back Better legislation was not ultimately included in the bill that was signed into law, but that was the object of a lot of attention. And so I think that probably now starts to come more into focus. Just now we're in the, just weeks after the reconciliation bill was signed into law, that is finally starting to grab people's attention again, as it did previously. And folks are trying to figure out, okay, what is the path forward on this? So full expensing, I think, is a little bit of a different animal, only because it's not a cliff. We don't go from full expensing to old school makers. We have this ramp down, 80, 60, 40, 20. And so that one will look and feel just a little bit different.
So the other strange thing about these expired provisions is this issue of what sense does it make to retroactively give people a tax break for something they already did? I mean, it's not going to change their behavior through the first 9 months of 2022. So why restore this retroactively?
Well, so I think, the argument would be you would be rewarding their faith in Congress that they were going to get this done, that they made those investments on the belief and prayer that Congress would actually do the work that Congress had signaled it was going to do, even if it was late to the game. And candidly, the flip side is, because Congress has a history of doing these things in arrears, if Congress were to leave a gap year, and just do it, only for 23, 24, and 25, you then tell businesses on a go-forward basis, you should not have faith in Congress. If they miss the deadline, you should immediately assume that the sky is falling and start cutting investments right away. And so Congress loses the luxury that it has built for itself of having the year that things expire and the year after things expire to deal with it without having sort of immediately deleterious effects on the economy. But if Congress breaks the faith with taxpayers and says, yeah, we didn't do it and we're not gonna, then the next time we run up against this, taxpayers will react with much more alacrity than they have this time. And so it's really a sort of like game theory, right? There's, we are all repeat players in this transaction, and it behooves all parties to play in a cooperative way because it maximizes welfare.
Of course, on the other hand, one could argue that it might be a good thing for the business community to force Congress to actually act on time on these provisions and not take an extra year every time this thing comes up.
I mean, a good thing from a long-term governance perspective, maybe, but not a good thing from a short-term, is it good or bad for the economy perspective? And, Congress is nothing if not motivated by the short term, hence a lot of like a $28 trillion national debt, for example. And so I think it would be, while that might be in the abstract a good thing, you would hope that it wouldn't take a real hit to the economy for Congress to realize, oh, wait, we should actually be doing these things prospectively, not in arrears.
So let me switch gears and ask you about the other big issue that's on the table, which is the child tax credit. So as I expect everybody knows, there was a very generous child tax credit in 2021. It's gone away. Progressives are very anxious to restore that 2021 version. Some of them say they'll oppose the business tax extenders unless Republicans agree to restore at least some elements of the 2021 version of the credit. So far, Republicans are lockstep opposing it. Is there any chance that they'll be willing to accept some restoration, more generous CTC in return for the business extenders we were just talking about?
So I can see sort of two versions of reality where something on the child tax credit gets done in year end. Version one is that the initial hypothetical that Republicans take the House proves not to be true. Democrats keep the House, and if they keep the House, they are likely to increase their majority in the Senate because these races are not entirely independent variables. And in a world where Democrats keep the House and are about to increase their majority in the Senate, then I think the dynamics of a year-end bill will look quite different than the one that we've been sort of discussing, and it opens up the aperture for a child tax credit piece, either at year-end, because if it doesn't happen at year-end, that opens up the possibility of another reconciliation bill in 2023, where if the majority had been increased and Senator Manchin's objections to the 2021 version of the child tax credit are no longer outcome determinative, you could see a different dynamic at play. Like, it's going to happen. It's either going to happen now or it's going to happen later. But in a world where Republicans have taken the House and maybe the Senate, but at a minimum, the House for purposes of this hypothetical, then on the child tax credit, I think about the child tax credit as having kind of the 2021 increase having kind of three elements, right? Increase the size of the credit, made it fully refundable, which was sort of in political parlance means remove the work incentive, and at least Republican political parlance. And then added this monthly payment feature, but that monthly payment feature was really derivative of the full refundability because you didn't need to establish income and liability to know that you were going to get the credit, and you could just get the payments out essentially in advance. Of those three kind of levers that are available, to me, the one that Republicans would be most likely to be willing to take a look at would be size of the credit, or even if you look inside the credit, the structure of the credit. Like, there are ways to expand the availability of the credit at some of the lower income cohorts without actually even increasing the overall size of the credit. So there were some ways in which to take the existing structure and kind of look underneath the hood and drive some benefit to lower and middle income families, consistent with what Democrats have been talking about, but without massively increasing the size of the credit, certainly without the full refundability piece and then the attendant monthly payment piece. And I think part of what's going on here, or maybe a lot of what's going on here, is, as you may recall, post 2021 March COVID bill, there was a lot of froth in the system about the unemployment checks, right? The size of the unemployment benefit and the degree to which it was disincentivizing people from returning to work. I think Republicans are very sensitive to doing anything that in their minds would further disincentivize work, especially given the labor market we're in. And so that is where full refundability, I think, becomes a real kind of not a dollars and cents red line, but a real policy red line. And if you're not doing full refundability, then monthly checks, are not really tenable because you need the full refundability feature to unlock that second piece. So I think there is maybe like that the word maybe is doing a lot of work in the sentence. Maybe some deal space here, but it would be, at a fraction of the dollar amount that the March COVID bill had. Not so much because of the dollars, or the dollars are part of it, but because the policy design features that Republicans might be able to live with would necessitate a score that would be a fraction of what the $150 billion a year that the March version came in at.
Sorry, let me be sure I'm clear. It sounds like what you're saying is that Republicans might be willing to do a deal that would increase benefits for very low income families, but there's a red line about a work requirement.
Yes, I think that's right. I think there's a red line about a work requirement, and the monthly payments are, again, kind of derivative of that refundability aspect. Yeah, but work, I think, is a really important feature, and it's both a sort of a policy principle, but it's also, you think about what happened last year, and there's some recent politics here. But you remember, at root, Republicans like the child tax credit. Like, they doubled it in the 2017 act. I think they would happily say, if you want to take the 1,000 to 2,000 and make that permanent, right? That expires 12/31/25, like all individual and passive provisions. I think Republicans would be on board with that. You could even maybe index that $2,000 because it's not an indexed number. So this is not something that root, like the core policy, is not a super partisan topic at all. The things you do with it can be made partisan, but underlying topic is actually not partisan.
I always like to remind people that the guy who actually popularized the idea of refundable tax credits in the United States was Milton Friedman. So yeah. You're right. And there's another element to this too, which is Mitt Romney, who has his own version of this. Democrats actually say they like some of the design features, although some elements they don't like. Republicans have been largely silent about it. Can you imagine something moving along the lines of what Romney has proposed? Obviously not this year, but maybe in 23, or is that something that doesn't happen until a big tax bill in 25?
I mean, you never say never, but my suspicion is something of that order of magnitude of change in the design and structure is probably more likely to show up in 25 when the individual and passive provisions are expiring, including the expansion of the child tax credit. So that issue is kind of extant. It's really hard to see past 12/31/25 for some of these provisions because we have this roughly $3 trillion size fiscal cliff that awaits us. And so even if you made something permanent in 2023, it's all up for grabs in 2025 again anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one other issue that may be on the table, as you mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, is retirement savings incentives. So the House passed a bill back in March. The Senate Finance Committee's got a pretty similar bill with a different name. What's your prognosis? Can that become law this year?
I think it can. Yeah, I think there's overwhelming bipartisan interest in doing that. It's got a certain kind of legacy element. Congressman Brady, former Chairman Brady, cares deeply about it. Senator Portman, who's retiring, cares deeply about it. And so, but not just Republicans. It's sort of bipartisan. It's extremely bipartisan, but overwhelmingly bipartisan. And so I think that has reasonably good odds. It does need some sort of vehicle to materialize. If we don't do anything tax at the end of the year and we're doing just short-term CRs until the spring or something like that, I guess it wouldn't be out of the question that the retirement security bill would pass, but it would become a much narrower path to success if there's not some sort of omnibus or year-long funding bill or some other tax legislation that's moving. You can well imagine, and this happens in Washington, D.C. all the time. Everyone supports retirement security, but they have other things they want, and they are reluctant to let retirement security go without the things they want. That's arguably what's happening on 174. I don't think there's anybody that opposes delaying or even outright repealing the requirement to capitalize and amortize your R&D expense, but it's gotten caught up in this like, oh, but I want something for it. The thing I want for it, you don't want to give, and so maybe it doesn't happen as a result.
So let's talk about 23 for just a couple of minutes. I have to tell you, I look ahead at 23, especially in the scenario you suggested where Republicans control the House, and it looks pretty grim. I see a year-long battle over the debt limit. There's going to be a second battle over a government shutdown. We'll hit the debt limit sometime in mid-year 23. The shutdown debate, of course, will come to a head next September. Given the track record of House Republican leaders, it seems to me a bloody fiscal battle seems inevitable with President Biden and maybe with Democrats in the Senate.
It's certainly possible. I hope springs eternal, and I'm an optimist that we don't end up in that result. I would note that while you've got, I think just about every House Republican has voted against increasing the debt limit in recent years. It is a different animal when you're in the majority, as President Obama himself acknowledged, right? When he was Senator Obama, not only voted against the debt limit, but said it was like, evidence of our fiscal irresponsibility, and then became president and realized, no, wait a second, I actually have to do this thing. This is important, and politicizing it is not super helpful. And so I think naturally, and both sides do this, right? Naturally, when you're in the majority and you have a responsibility to govern, you view some of these must do, even if politically unpalatable, must do items somewhat differently. But it is, yes, the debt limit in particular is one that is a little bit fraught with peril. Government shutdowns aren't good, but we do them with enough regularity to know that it's neither the end of the world. Defaulting on our debt is an entirely different animal, one with much more severe economic consequences. And so having, as a veteran of the debt limit wars, I'm still scarred by how close we came to defaulting in 2011. And, that is one definitely to keep an eye on. But, they will have I don't know if it's the summer or it's going to be the fall, but at some point, Q2, Q3, we're going to hit it, then extraordinary measures kick in. So we may have up to a year from where we are right now before this thing becomes like a must-do item. So there's lots of time for Treasury and the administration to kind of start communicating with Congress when is the deadline, what it's going to take, and kind of how much time we have. So we've got some time before we have to kind of consider this a full-on panic.
But bottom line, is there a significant risk that the U.S. will actually default?
I would hope not. No, I think at the end of the day, Congress always finds a way to do the right thing, even if they try everything else first.
Is there any chance, do you think, that if Republicans win control of the House, that Democrats will try to extend the debt limit beyond next year in a lame duck session this year?
That's an interesting question. It seems a little hard to imagine, only because that would mean Congress was turning in its homework almost a full year early, right? As we sit here with tax extenders that expired at the end of 2021 still yet unaddressed. We know Congress's default position is not to turn its homework early, but rather to turn it in quite late and ask for forgiveness. And so I would be a little surprised, happily surprised, I should say, but still surprised if we were able to deal with a debt limit so far in advance of it actually being a real deadline.
So given what we were just talking about, what do you think the chances are of a significant tax bill in 23?
So I think it depends on whether we do anything this year. If we don't do any tax bill this year, then there will be a lot of pressure to do a significant tax bill in 2023, at least to deal with the provisions that are yet unaddressed. And once you're doing that, maybe it becomes a vehicle for doing more. If we do a year-end tax bill, let's hypothesize that at a minimum we do the retro 2022 and the prospective 2023, so these things won't have expired immediately after enactment, then the prospects for a big tax bill in 2023 that gets signed into law, I think, are pretty low. I think there'll be a lot of messaging that happens, and we will be in the 2-year run-up to the expiration of all the individual and pass-through provisions. And I know from having gone through this with Senator McConnell when I was his deputy chief of staff, a lot of the negotiation actually happens in the years before, in the positions that the parties are taking, whether it's the president and his budget, Republicans in the bills they introduce and vote on. And so, frankly, a lot of the negotiation had been settled even before Senator McConnell and then Vice President Biden entered the room to do the final negotiation. And that's what the next 2 years probably end up becoming more about.
We are out of time. Rohit Kumar, it's a pleasure always to talk to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Take care, and thanks to our audience.